Hello and a very warm welcome back to your Widowed AF special, What About the Children? Today I'm going to be speaking to somebody I went to school with. Her name's Steph. Hello, Steph.
Hi.
Now, Steph's dad died, and he died from suicide when she was just 14 years old. I won't disclose her exact age, but let's say we're the same school year. Now, I had no idea, and it wasn't until fairly recently, in fact, I think it was when Ben died or a little after, that Steph reached out to me and sort of told me her story. And I have rather put her on the spot and asked if she would mind if I recorded her story for this purpose. And she's very kindly agreed. So, Steph, I understand this is a very, very emotive subject for you and potentially for many of our listeners, but I really genuinely believe the more we talk about this, the better, because there is such a stigma attached to mental health, and particularly in men, and particularly a certain amount of years ago.
Yeah.
So, Steph, if you don't mind, in much the way I ask my lovely widowed guests to tell their story, I'm going to ask you to do much the same. And if you would just take us back to, before the horrible, the end. What was life living with your dad prior to this? Because presumably there were some signs.
So my parents actually split up when I was 7.
Okay.
So they weren't together when my dad took his life. And I don't know if it I just have a bad memory or I've just blocked stuff out because, I have friends who have known me since I was 5 and been involved in, my whole life. And they often will tell me things and I just can't remember. So I was aware, not that did I see? I don't know. My dad was in the RAF before I was born. And when he came out, I don't know, because we don't really talk about it. It's never really been spoken about. So it's just bits and pieces that I've heard from his family and from my mum, that he didn't cope very well. So took to drink and drank a lot. My parents met and married very, very quickly in 2 weeks. And
2 weeks?
2 weeks, yes. And then went on to have 3 children really, really quickly. And
Wow.
From what my mum has said, my dad didn't cope very well with that and drank a lot. Now, I don't ever remember seeing him drunk when we lived together. I don't pre them splitting up. I don't have memories really of us as a family.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Because that could be your own sort of brain protecting you if there were perhaps some traumatic moments and things like that. And where if it sounds like he was in active addiction with alcohol, and it does make for a chaotic life, particularly with 3 kids, and often ex-military do come with some PTSD as well. Hey.
Yeah.
So then your parents then split up when you were 7. Do you think it was as a result of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So they split up, and this is where it gets really blurred. We used to live in Bedfordshire, and I started school in Bedfordshire. And then when my parents split up, we moved in with my grandparents in St Albans. But my dad would sometimes be there and sometimes not.
Okay.
And that's when I think that's probably my first memory of him being drunk, actually not drunk, passed out, and my mum trying to change the bed with him asleep on there because I'd been sick. And I'm sort of jumping now because then we my grandparents then moved to Wales, and my mum decided that she didn't want to move us again. So we stayed in St Albans, and we actually had to move into a hostel to wait for housing.
Gosh.
And I vaguely remember my dad sometimes being there, sometimes not. And then we moved to another temporary accommodation, and then he was never there. And that's when I remember seeing him sort of at the weekends, but I can't tell you whether that was, every weekend or every other weekend. But, there's pictures of my Holy Communion and he was there. There's pictures of us visiting friends with like his friends. One particular, we went to Halifax to visit some friends, and it was me and my sisters and my dad. So we did see him.
It sounds like he was part of your life.
Yeah. I mean, I think very, very loosely, but it didn't make me love him any less.
Yeah.
And then we got a house. My mum was given a house, which we moved into. And again, he was sometimes there and sometimes not. And then he got a job working in Germany. So it was at a time where builders were going over to Germany. I don't know if you... so he was back and forth working there, and then he'd come back, and then and eventually he... so that was around when I was 8. And then he decided to move to Germany. So he moved to Germany then. And then we would just keep in contact via phone, or he would come back unannounced and just turn up to see us. And
it's not like where you've got your, we can FaceTime and text and WhatsApp and things like this. Because my dad works abroad. He didn't move abroad, but he works abroad. And I can remember calling, he worked for Sky News at the time. Like I remember calling them and going, can you just tell me when my dad is coming back? And this was from the payphone at Beaumont.
Oh, wow.
Whereas now it's different, isn't it? You can potentially have a separated or an estranged parent that lives abroad that you can stay in contact with quite easily. But that must have been very strange for you as a child, and actually perhaps a sense of being abandoned by your dad already, even before he did leave. I don't know. I'm sort of taking things off on a tangent, Steph. It's something.
No. I think that is, abandonment is big.
Mm-hmm.
So then he moved out there, and he would come back and forth. Not regularly. It was not regularly. Maybe once a year. I don't really remember. He'd send us gifts. And my mum met and had another partner who we all, my sisters and I, gave absolute hell with when we first moved in.
I can remember you as a kid.
Very unpleasant. But he's still, he is still with us today as a step father, and I, love him very much.
So congratulations. That's an achievement.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, took on 3 children, and it. He just did. So, in that time, probably when we were being horrible to my parents, to my mum and my stepdad, and he's not my dad and things like that, we were very aware that, or, I was made aware. And again, I don't know if I was sat down and told, or I just heard whispered conversations. We weren't really allowed. We didn't see any of my dad's family at all. He had a sister called Debbie, who I would see occasionally, but we didn't really have much to do with his family once he left for Germany. And we saw lots of my mum's family, and none of them had anything nice to say about my dad, and we sort of took that on board. So it was sort of, we weren't to speak about him. But, in that period of time, I heard that, he had tried to take his own life. And I do remember him being in a car accident at some point in my childhood, and just thinking it was a car accident, but actually it was, he'd got into the car drunk and he had driven it into the tree to try and kill himself. And then apparently my mum, and again, this is all, stuff that I remember, but I don't know why I remember. But apparently she'd intercepted a letter. He had written a letter to us children, saying that he was going to kill himself. And again, I don't know if I found that out after he'd killed himself or before. I don't know. I don't think I was aware really before he did it. But so that sort of went on.
I'm trying to think if mental health at all was mentioned, while we were at school and that sort of age. And it wasn't. And it particularly wasn't mentioned in terms of men and in terms of suicidal ideation and eventual suicide. And so as a child, especially, you would probably have been quite sheltered from that element, you would think, wouldn't you? But it's hard to, as you say, it's really difficult to go back into a period of your life that A, is that long ago, and B, was quite turbulent, and pick out the exact timeline and details. So please don't worry too much about the sort of the details, because this, the value is in your story, which is incredibly powerful so far already.
Yeah. So that went on for a few years, and then he came back. So he took his life in April 94, but in the months before, he'd come back and he took us out for dinner, and I know exactly where we were, and he told us that he was coming home and that he didn't.
Steph. It's okay, take a minute. This is tough, right? Even 14 years. No, not 14. You were 14. Sorry, gosh.
No, that's such.
Even, I'm trying to think, 30 years, 28 years?
A long time ago. So
what did he say to you at this dinner?
He said that he was going to come home and that he missed us and was going to move back to be near us. So that was massive.
Yeah, of course.
We were looking forward to that. And then fast forward to April, the 12th. And I was at Claire Beavis's house.
Oh.
And my mum phoned and said that she needed to come and pick me up. And I remember thinking, oh, that doesn't seem right. Maybe my grandma's died. So she came and picked me up. And I can't remember if my sisters were in the car or whether we then went to pick them up from wherever they were. And we were taken home and told that he was dead. Now I can't even. So I can remember where I was when my mum picked me up, and then I can remember her telling us in the living room at home that he'd died or killed. I don't even remember. I don't even even know.
I was going to ask what language you used, because now we're very aware that you have to be very factual with children, and you have to not leave any room for ambiguity. But then, of course, we need none of this.
No.
And it must, I mean, I don't know how you begin to tell a child that a parent has taken their own life, and especially without the internet for support in what language.
Nothing. And I think, when I talk to my mum now, and she just had no idea, she had no idea how to tell us what to do after. There didn't seem, but it didn't, I don't think, because he didn't live with us, I don't think it was, I don't know. And I remember her telling us, but then I remember just saying, oh, can you take me back to Claire's? And it was sort of, and I sit there and I think now, like, I can't have taken it in, because that was,
No, it's like the children that when we've told them, and I can only really use my own personal experiences, anecdotal, but I told Monty and Hector, and they made that horrific noise, and then I kid you not, like half an hour later, they both had capes on and Harry Potter swords,
Yeah.
not swords, wands,
Yeah.
and they were probably using them as swords, to be fair. And I just at that time thought to myself, my kids are psychopaths. Like, what's the matter with them? And
Yeah.
it's not that you want them to cry, but you're like, how are you not feeling this? And it was only when I became involved in the widowed community that I realized that it is such a common reaction, because even at 14, you just haven't got the emotional maturity to comprehend that your dad no longer exists. And particularly the idea that he may have made that choice himself. Now, Steph, you don't have to answer my question, but are you comfortable sharing how he took his life?
Yeah, he hung himself.
I thought it possibly tends to be the method of choice for men, doesn't it? It seems this incredibly impulsive decision that has such permanent consequences. And you can kind of hear bits of impulsivity from him throughout what you've told me, you know, the sort of sporadic visits, the drinking, the promises to come home.
Yeah.
He was obviously a man who was battling very much with his own head in a world where it was not necessarily okay to admit that, particularly for, you know, RAF military man.
Yeah. No, I don't know. I don't know. I think as well, because I mean, again, it's only as I've got older that, you know, I've spoken. I'm very close to his sister. You know, because I actively, well, no, not at that age. So it was only sort of, we then, after my dad's funeral, which I don't really remember, if I'm honest. Like, I don't really remember. And then we saw nothing of his family at all.
So sad.
Yeah. And then when I was 18, I decided to knock on my granddad's door and built a relationship with him, and then my dad's family. And now I ended up caring for my granddad for many, many years, and I'm very, very close with my dad's sister. And it's, you know, when you listen to their story, you know, they don't mention, I don't talk about his, my granddad would, you know, never sort of said that he drank, but he alluded to the fact that he did. Whereas my aunties have never said it, never said it. And it's just, you know, I talk to them about him, and I talk to my mum about, you know, the other stuff. So because he did it in Germany, it was all very. My auntie said that when he was found, there it looked like there'd been a struggle that he tried to stop. But, you know, we don't know. And then he was cremated and then sent over without permission. So, you know, there's lots of unanswered questions for them, even more unanswered questions for us. So, yeah, that was that. And then my teenage years are quite a blur. I don't think I was very pleasant. I was struggling.
I was trying to think back to how I remember you from that sort of age, because we weren't in the same class. We went to a Beaumont school, for anybody who's interested, in St Albans, and we were in the same year group, but not in the same class. And I can remember us being at parties together, and, you know, and I've got one weird memory of you, and I think it was Kerry, and it just sticks in my head that you guys were really, really close friends, and being quite jealous of the closeness that you had. And then, but I don't remember you going off the rails or behaving in a way that seemed to me to be abnormal. But then I was probably off doing my own crazy going off the rails stuff. But how, you didn't tell anybody? Did you tell even your closest of friends?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, you know, obviously I went back to Claire's, so she knew. But I was embarrassed, ashamed. It's not something that you want to say.
No. And I'm just feeling really sorry for 14-year-old Steph here, because those are feelings that you shouldn't be feeling at that age. And to be feeling those feelings as a result of a tragedy makes me feel really sad. And there should have, I mean, it's a different time, I know that, but even now, children often don't tend to tell sort of their peers because they don't want to be teased or they don't want to be bullied. And the idea that that goes on just breaks my heart.
Yeah, I don't even, I can't, and I'll have to ask my mum actually if she even told the school.
Yeah.
Like, I don't, I never spoke to a teacher, or I was never called out at school to just, to be offered
no therapy sessions and
no, yeah, or just any support. Like, I really don't remember.
So do you think that you sort of dealt with your own pain by kind of leaning into sort of teenage rebellion and being, you say, by being
No, so I don't think I mean, throughout my I obviously did things that, is not sensible. But no, I never caused I would never cause my mum any problems. I was never naughty at school. I think I skipped school a few times. I did try and take my own life about a year after.
Oh gosh, Steph, I didn't know.
It was a cry for help. I just took lots of tablets one day. And then I had some therapy, the free sessions that you get from the doctor. But I didn't, I think I did maybe one or two and then just thought, I'm just going to tell them I'm all right. And that has been it, really. I've had a few, I've dipped in and out of therapy when I've felt like, I've drowned. But I just haven't, I can cope keeping it in a box.
Yeah, that'll come. I know Pandora's box well. Firstly, I'm really sorry that you felt that desperate. I too, probably around the same time, took an overdose of tablets, because the problem is when you're feeling something that's invisible, you need other people to see it. And I'm convinced that that's why a lot of people self-harm or take an overdose that perhaps they don't really mean to intend to end their life, but they just need a way of letting the outside world see the pain that they're in. And that's really what I'm hearing there, is that you just needed to be seen. And now we know that things like mental health are hereditary. We know that children of suicide, children bereaved by suicide are more likely to have mental health problems. We know this. We don't know. I don't know whether it's a biological thing or whether it's due to the trauma, but you must have to keep quite a close eye on your own mental health. And does it cause you concern for your children or anything? Do you worry?
So I don't. I'm really. Listen, I think I had a little bit of a wobble at the beginning, at some point this year. I got a dog. Everything was just, I was listening to your podcast, and I think I have never, I think if you spoke to my friends, I haven't ever dealt with my dad's death.
Yeah.
I have continually, and I still do, think, and I think this is why I don't do therapy, because every time I go, and I obviously tell my story, I think through my teens and my 20s, I thought about it, but just pushed it to the back of my, I've got a really, really secure friendship group. After my dad died, actually, I had a complete change in friendship groups. And I think that was because of losing my dad. I just needed to change everything. And those friends are still my core friends now. And I think they carried me through, knew about it. We didn't talk about it, which is what I wanted, how I wanted it. And through my 20s. And then, just having my own children.
I suppose me off in a minute.
Just that we weren't enough.
Yeah. That's the really, really tricky and painful thing when somebody leaves by suicide, because it feels like it's a choice. And you can know logically as an adult that it's not a choice, and that anybody who's so desperate that they take their own life is in absolute agony. But I know when I explained Ben's death to my children, I was able to say to them, there'll be children in your class whose daddies have walked out on them, who've never seen them, who've chosen to leave them. Your daddy would never have left you. Never in a million years would he have left you. But when somebody that's not a concept that's very easy to understand as a child, or somebody living with the fact that their dad has chosen in their eyes to take their life and not spend their life with them. And subsequently you get all the grief attacks, which I'm anticipating as my children grow up, the weddings, them having children. And it must leave you with just this sense of loss. And I'm wondering if it is to a certain degree like being widowed, in that it doesn't really ever leave you. You just sort of have to learn to kind of grow around it and carry it with you. But where you've not really spoken about it or had the opportunity to really explore those feelings, you mentioned the box, that Pandora's box that's locked really tightly closed. And it's a shame that you've had to do that, but I do understand that it's a coping method, because you can't walk around with that level of grief for 20 odd years.
No. And I think it is that. And I do flit, and not doing therapy. I get to the point, you tell your story and then they try and, it isn't my fault. And, if I've got my logic head on, obviously he was in a really bad place to do that. But I very quickly think about, and I wouldn't, I haven't thought from, when I was 15, I have not ever once thought about taking my life again. And I don't suffer, or I don't, maybe if I didn't keep myself so busy, I might suffer from depression. I don't feel like I do. Like, they put me on antidepressants after I took my own life. And I very quickly realised that actually, no, this isn't, because although I wasn't crying, I couldn't laugh. And so it's like I just felt nothing. And I didn't, and I knew I knew even then that is not what I wanted, because, and I still feel like that. Like, I don't, there's never been a time where I felt so low that I just wanted to feel nothing, because I do want to laugh and I do want to, that's what gets me through. And so, I haven't, but I don't, I have nothing to do with my younger sister, because she is dealing, she has such hatred for me because I didn't help her when Dad died. But, it was like I was drowning in my own coping. So, and she really, really does suffer with her mental health, and one of my children, she really suffers. So it is, I do understand that mental health runs in the family, and I can see that. I don't feel like I suffer with my mental health. I feel like I suffer with how my dad went, and my relationship with him and everything surrounding it, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. It does make a lot of sense. And I also, I'm aware just from, sort of being an acquaintance of yours through the years that you exercise and you do a lot of the sort of stacking, the dopamine stacking. So you do a lot of things that are good for your mental health as well as keeping yourself busy. And I do think that whilst it can be quite difficult to do those things some days, those people that are aware of mental health and that they may be vulnerable and that they need to model good behaviour for their children, it's, my kids see me muttering about taking the bloody dog out in the rain in the mornings, and things like that. But you're doing it. You do. Yeah, especially when I got lost the dog this morning. An hour I spent looking for that stupid animal in the woods. I was tempted to leave.
I feel exactly the same about my puppy.
It's like, well, it'd be one less thing to bloody look after, won't it? But that's not actually how I felt. And how about with your kids? You talk quite openly about it with your children.
We really, really do. And I think they didn't know. And I was obviously they found out in a really terrible way, and I was having a really bad day, and I turned up to a birthday party. I think it was after, I think it was quite, I don't know, I'd separated from the children's dad, and I'd taken one of them, I don't know who, to a birthday party, but we turned up 2 weeks early. So we turned up to the party, and we'd gone in, and there was no party. And we got back in the car, and I don't know which one of them was going, "This is the worst day of my life." And I felt like a terrible parent, and I just blurted out, like, "Shall I tell you what the worst day of my life was?" When my dad hung himself. And I just remember it coming out and then thinking, what? What did you just say that for? So then, since then, we've spoken really openly about it. And, one of my children, like I said, she was suffering really badly with her anxiety, and she has been diagnosed with anxiety and depression. And so we do talk about it. And because I never, ever want it to be shoved under the carpet. And we recently had a family. My children have lost quite a few people close to them. I think of my friends, and I care. They've lost all of their great grandparents they were really close to, and they have lost them. And my auntie and my uncle have died, who they knew. So they've had quite a lot of loss in their really short life. So we do talk really openly about it. But we did have a situation where, not on my side of the family, but on their dad's side of the family, somebody recently tried to take their own life. And, I spoke to the children about that. And I spoke to somebody, who's involved with the children in the care with... doctors' services.
You can just cut that out.
Cut that bit. They questioned. They said that the children shouldn't have been told that this person had tried to take their life. And I said, no, I don't agree. I don't agree with you. Like, my dad took his own life, and it was a secret. No one spoke, but we were told that day, and then it was never mentioned again. And this was their auntie on their dad's side, and I just thought, no, because if my children are ever at crisis point, I want them to come and tell me, and I want them to know that she got help and she's undergoing help now, and hopefully that will be the last of it. But also, and I want the children to know.
It's quite important, I think, that we do talk about it as a suicide as a concept, because like you say, it was so taboo and so unspoken about. And to even say the words, "I feel like I don't want to be here anymore," are very, very difficult for other people to hear and for people to say when they're at crisis point. And by keeping a dialogue that's open, that you talk about mental health, that but I do, and I'm sure you do. Will sometimes say to the kids, I'm just feeling really crappy today, and my mood is really bad. Sometimes you just can't shake it, but it takes away that stigma and secrecy and shame of mental health. And I don't know whether this is harsh, but perhaps for them to see the end result if mental health is not dealt with.
Yeah.
Because that's the tragedy of it, is that if we don't talk about it and people don't seek help, the worst bit is when you seek help and you're not given it. And that is, unfortunately repeated time after time and time in these circumstances. But yeah, I think that being able to openly talk about feeling crap, and even if it is hearing the words, I don't want to be here, they're horrible words to hear, but they probably don't mean it. But by able to, it loses its power, doesn't it? The power goes.
I think as well, if somebody is telling you they do want to be here, they just don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Because, I believe that all of the times, and I don't know how many times there were that he tried to take his life before, but no one knew this time. There was no, there was no note, there was no, sending a letter, there was nothing. And, having lost my dad, and I, sadly know, I know a couple of other people that lost family members to that, and they're the same. No one knew. And I do really believe that if they are intent on taking their life and they've had it and they don't want help and or whatever, no one knows. There's no warning signs. They're just gone.
And I think particularly with men, it can be that very impulsive decision. It happened to a friend of mine not that long ago, actually, and it was just so traumatic and sudden, and you can't quite believe that he meant to do it, that he was just really angry and really drunk. And it's I don't know. It's like I'm trying to think of the right word here, but the way it's sort of going, it's the sort of the male response, isn't it? The male response is to fix things in instant, kind of working things out, and in their mind, perhaps that is the instant fix to a problem that they can't seem to solve. But I spoke to a wonderful woman whose husband she's in America, so they have access. He had a gun, unfortunately, and he was on the phone to mental health support begging, and they were just saying there's nothing more we can offer you. And then she heard a gunshot, and that's it. It's over. The person you love has just ceased to exist. And the fact that can happen when it's happened to me, in a millisecond, and it happened to you in your family with your dad, and it leaves you with you may not even have been able to identify it as particularly growing up, but this sense of threat, that you're under threat, that something terrible may happen to you. And we know now that that's sort of fight or flight and cortisol and the hormones, and we understand it. But back then, you wouldn't have understood that. You would have just felt very, very frightened, and like the stability had gone. But I suppose what I wanted to do by speaking to you was to demonstrate that a child can go through something that is as catastrophic as that, but you managed to form a relationship with your stepfather. You've managed to, I know you've separated from your children's father, but you're in a happy relationship now, I believe. And you have 3 children who, are being loved and treasured by you. So you haven't ended up in a mental institution. You haven't ended up going off the rails. You haven't ended up, taking your own life or ending up with severe mental health problems as a result. And whilst we all struggle, there are struggles. Perimenopause is one of our favourites, right? I think that it is going to be helpful for some people to hear that, yes, it is a horrible, horrible, horrible shock, and it is a horrible way to lose somebody, but that it doesn't end up being the thing that defines a child through the rest of their life. You don't introduce yourself as, hello, I'm Steph, my dad killed himself when I was 7, do you?
No.
That's not how it works.
No, I do, not to put a dampener on, no, I don't. And, but it is still tough. I do. And that's why, I had to stop listening to. I listened to every single one of your podcasts every week when it came out, and the catch up at the beginning of the week, or after the episode. And I think my feelings, because I haven't dealt with it, were really, really raw. And I think I just had to put everything back in a box. And that is, one day I do think that I'll access therapy and see it through, but I'm not ready now. Not while my children are young.
And you have to be ready.
Yeah, and it's not every day. I am not sad. I'm not sad every day. I really am not. There are just poignant, and it will come out of nowhere. It will. Yeah. But it's just like, I lost my granddad, and it's like, days like, that hits me. But it isn't every day. But I do sometimes still think I wasn't enough. I know that is not the case,
but knowing it and telling your lizard brain,
yeah. So no, I'm not sad every day, and it hasn't defined me. I imagine if you spoke to my younger sister, it most definitely has defined her, and that sadly is, mental health for you. My way is to exercise, stay busy, focus all of the time. Because I don't want to be sad.
No, I don't want to be sad either, Steph. And I can hear that. You wake up in the morning sometimes and you're just like, I just don't want to be sad today. I just don't want to be sad today. What can I do? And sometimes I have a pad by my bed and I'm like, right, okay, take your meds, get up, walk the dog, have a nice bath, and I'll write down the steps that I need to try and make myself not sad. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think just by trying, that's enough. And I think probably you're right that one day you will just decide that it's the right time for therapy. For me, it was 2 years ago, and I was drunk at Tabby's birthday party, and I just felt this kind of shame and realization that I couldn't just keep literally drowning my feelings about my husband drowning. And I've found a really good therapist, and I've been going every week for 2 years, but it's broken me back down again. Like I've had to go back in, and because it's only been coming up to 6 years for me, but there's so much of it that I had squashed, so many other feelings. And I think therapy it's brutal. You don't go into therapy. I mean, some people.
I think that's why I work that. I think I'm not ready for that. No, I've numbed my feelings in other ways for many, 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 many years. And at the moment, I'm doing okay. And I think, I'm not ready for the brutalness of therapy.
No, and when you are, and when you are, you will be, and you'll find somebody, and it will be tough. But there's all that Pandora's box has got to be open at some point, I guess. But I think the key thing that I'm really taking from the chat with you today, apart from that I really want to give you a hug, is that it's how we talk to children when something like this happens. And you're not the first person that I've spoken to who lost somebody back when we were children, where it was just not spoken about. And even when they died of a inverted commas sort of normal condition, or the family was still together, it was still just never mentioned, photos taken down, that sort of thing. And it's almost like, in order to protect the children from the pain, they would just pretend they didn't exist, which of course actually makes it all so much worse. And we've come a long way. We have come a long way. I would like to think that if this were to happen to you now, that the school would offer some support. But having reached out for support desperately for my kids, there still isn't a huge amount out there. But things are changing, and I'm really proud of you for being brave enough to come and tell your story, because it isn't an easy story to tell. Nobody wants to talk about this. They don't. It's kind of the final taboo, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
But the more and more we do, then hopefully gradually we chip away at this system. I mean, who knows? If only we could wave a magic wand and offer all the support to the people that need it, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. But your podcast, and I will start listening again. I just need to
just do the chatty ones.
Yeah, there were a few that, oh goodness, doing the dog walks, listening to, there was some crying.
Well, I have to be honest with you, Steph, I find it very difficult to listen back to them because I sit in the interview with them, obviously, and I feel very honoured to do so. And then John will listen back when he edits, and then we'll sort of listen back, particularly if there's a gap between that and the wash up. And sometimes I'm like, I don't remember that. And it's almost like I don't know. It's like it vanishes from your memory. I suppose perhaps it's to protect yourself, but I don't know. But thank you for taking the time to come on today, Steph. I do really appreciate it. And I will absolutely come and give you that cuddle before too long. And you're now an official member of the WAF family without actually having to be widowed. So congratulations.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you for being gentle.
No, of course, darling. And thank you for being so candid and honest. And I really hope that your story is one that goes on to help people. And I think the real takeaway from this is don't shy away from those conversations. No. Talk to your children about mental health, talk to each other, and, seek help if you need it. But thank you, Steph. No. And I wish you and your family lots and lots of love.
Yeah. And we'll see you soon.
Take care, darling.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you found this episode helpful, hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you think someone else may benefit from this, please do share. We'd also really appreciate a quick review. It helps more people find the show. Thank you again, and see you next time on Widowed AF.